Somewhere in Europe, around the year 1600, a physician opened a small ceramic jar, measured out a careful pinch of dark brown powder, and handed it to his patient with complete confidence. The powder smelled faintly of bitumen and old earth. It had been ground from the body of a human being dead for over 1,000 years. The patient swallowed it. The doctor recorded it. The pharmacist restocked it. And this was not a fringe practice, this was mainstream European medicine, prescribed by the most educated physicians on the continent, sold in licensed pharmacies, and consumed by kings. This is the history of mumia, corpse medicine, one of the strangest, most documented, and most deliberately forgotten chapters in the story of human healing. Tonight we go all the way in. Chapter 1: The Black Resin and the Word That Started Everything. The word mumia does not originally mean a mummy. It comes from the Arabic mumia, derived from the Persian mum, meaning wax or bitumen, a black, tar-like mineral pitch that seeped naturally from rocks in parts of Persia, and was believed by medieval Islamic physicians to have powerful healing properties. The 11th century Persian physician Avicenna, Ibn Sina, wrote about mumia as a remedy for fractures, bruising, paralysis, and poisoning. His Canon of Medicine, one of the most influential medical texts in history, circulated through Islamic and then European universities for centuries, carrying the concept of mumia with it. Here is where the fatal confusion enters. When European traders and scholars encountered Egyptian mummies, they noticed that many of them appeared coated in or saturated with a dark, resinous substance. The embalming resins, cedar oil, natron, bitumen, had darkened and hardened over millennia. They looked, to a medieval eye, remarkably like mumia. The logical leap, in a pre-scientific age, was almost inevitable. If mineral bitumen is medicine, and Egyptian mummies are soaked in bitumen, then mummies must be medicine. The dead bodies of ancient Egypt became pharmacological raw material almost overnight. The 13th century Arab scholar Abd el-Latif al-Baghdadi, visiting Egypt around 1200, documented locals already breaking into tombs and selling the contents. He describes mummy substance being traded and consumed. His account is one of the earliest written records of the trade that would explode across the Mediterranean over the next 4 centuries. Chapter 2: The Pharmacy of the Dead, How the Trade Worked. By the 15th century, the market for Egyptian mummy had become a formal commercial enterprise. Merchants in Alexandria and Cairo operated openly, sourcing bodies from ancient burial sites in the desert, grinding or chopping them, and packaging the material for export to European apothecaries. The English merchant John Sanderson, traveling in Egypt in 1586, documented purchasing mummy material with the casual efficiency of a man buying cloth. He recorded acquiring 600 pounds of mummy, roughly 272 kilograms, in a single transaction, shipping it back to England as legitimate cargo. Sanderson described the mummies themselves in a letter with no apparent horror, noting their color, texture, and smell with the detachment of a commodities broker. He was not unusual. He was typical. The supply chain had its own dark economy. Local Egyptian tomb robbers, called mumia hunters in contemporary accounts, would locate ancient burials, extract the bodies, and sell them to middlemen in the cities. The middlemen sold to exporters. The exporters sold to apothecaries in Venice, Paris, London, and Amsterdam, who ground the material, bottled it, and sold it to physicians. By the 16th century, mummy had become a standard line item in European pharmacy catalogues alongside pepper, saffron, and theriac. It was not exotic contraband. It was a recognized, priced, and routinely restocked commodity. Chapter 3: What they thought it cured. The list of conditions for which mumia was prescribed reads like a survey of everything that could go wrong with a human body. Francis Bacon, a foundational figure in the development of empirical science, listed it as a remedy in his Silva Silvarum, published in 1627, recommending it for stanching blood. The French pharmacist Nicolas Lamiere's 1697 Dictionnaire universel des drogues simples listed mumia as effective for bruising, epilepsy, paralysis, and as a general strengthener. Lamiere was not a crank. His dictionary was a serious reference work used by working physicians. The German physician and alchemist Oswald Kroll, writing in 1609, went further, recommending mumia for nearly 30 separate conditions including vertigo, gout, plague, and poisoning. His Basilica Chymica was a serious alchemical medical text and was taken seriously. The theoretical framework underpinning all of this was Galenic humoral medicine, filtered through alchemical thinking. A well-preserved body, the reasoning went, must contain a concentrated vital essence, a spirit, that could be transferred to a living patient. The older and better preserved the mummy, the stronger the medicine. There was also a strand of what scholars calls weapon salve theory, the idea that like treats like, that the substance of a powerful preserved thing could transmit its power. A mummy that had lasted 1,000 years in the desert, surely something in it could be transferred to a failing, mortal body. Chapter 4, Kings and Corpses, the Royal Appetite for the Dead. Perhaps the most striking illustration of how mainstream this practice was, King Francis I of France reportedly carried a small packet of mummy powder mixed with ground rhubarb wherever he travelled, as a personal emergency remedy. The King of France. A packet of ground ancient human being. King Charles II of England went further. After suffering what appears to have been a series of small strokes in his final illness in 1685, he was treated by a team of royal physicians using a preparation known as the King's Drops, a distillate of human skull in alcohol. The recipe had been developed partly by Charles himself, who maintained a personal laboratory. The King's Drops, also called Spirit of Skull, appear in multiple contemporary medical records of Charles II's final days in February 1685. The irony that the King of England died while being administered ground human skull was apparently lost on no one at the time, because no one found it remarkable. Charles II died on February 6, 1685. His physicians considered the human skull treatment among the more reasonable of the interventions they had attempted. That is a sentence about the 17th century that needs no elaboration. Chapter 5, The Man Who Went to Check, Guy de la Fontaine and the Fakes. By the mid-16th century, the demand for Egyptian mummies so vastly outpaced the supply of actual ancient mummies that a counterfeit industry had emerged, and it operated at enormous scale. This was not occasional fraud. It was systematic, organized, and, when finally investigated, brazenly admitted. In 1564, a French physician named Guy de la Fontaine, traveling in Alexandria on behalf of the French court, decided to investigate the mummy trade at its source. He sought out the principal merchant supplier of mummy in the city and asked to see the stock. What he found was not what his patients had been consuming. The merchant, with no apparent shame, showed de la Fontaine a warehouse containing the prepared bodies of recently dead people, executed criminals, plague victims, the indigent dead, that had been dried, darkened with bitumen, and wrapped in linen to pass as ancient Egyptian mummies. When de la Fontaine asked how long this had been going on, the merchant reportedly shrugged and said, "For many years." De la Fontaine's account, published and circulated among European physicians, caused significant alarm, not because doctors were consuming ground human beings, which they knew, but because they might not be consuming the right ground human beings. The therapeutic concern was authenticity, not ethics. The scholar Richard Sugg, whose 2011 academic study Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires is one of the most comprehensive modern surveys of this practice, estimates that the counterfeit mummy industry was likely producing more material than the genuine article by the late 16th century. The European medicine cabinet was largely stocked with recently murdered or recently dead Egyptians, not ancient pharaonic ones. Chapter 6, Beyond Mummy, the Full Pharmacopoeia of the Human Body. Egyptian mummy powder was only the most famous ingredient in a far broader tradition of using human remains as medicine. The European pharmacopoeia of the 16th through 18th centuries included human blood, human fat, human skull, human sweat, human saliva, human urine, and preparations made from the placenta and the heart. Human blood was particularly prized when fresh. Epilepsy was the condition most frequently targeted. In 16th and 17th century Europe, it was documented practice for epileptics to drink the blood of freshly executed criminals at the scaffold, sometimes sold by executioners themselves as a sideline. The executioner as medical supplier is not a metaphor. In German-speaking Europe, executioners held a quasi-licensed role as providers of medicinal human material. Executed criminal fat, called poor sinner's fat in German records, Armisunderfett, was rendered and sold as a topical treatment for joint pain, wounds, and skin conditions. Robert Boyle, a foundational figure in modern chemistry with a rigorous experimental mind, included in his 1692 medical collection several recipes using human skull, human blood, and moss grown on a human skull. Boyle was not being superstitious. He was applying the best scientific framework available to him. If something had been observed to work, you recorded it. Human skull was processed into a powder called usnea, sometimes also referring to the moss that grew on unburied skulls, and prescribed for nosebleeds, epilepsy, and headaches. The skull of a man who had died by violence, particularly hanging, was considered especially potent. The logic, violent death preserved a stronger vital spirit in the bone. Chapter 7: The Surgeons Who Objected, and Why They Lost. Not everyone accepted corpse medicine without question. Ambroise Pare, the great 16th-century French surgeon, widely regarded as a father of modern surgery, wrote a detailed, furious refutation of mumia in 1585. His argument was both practical and moral. Practically, he had seen no reliable evidence it worked. Morally, it was an abomination. Pare wrote, in a passage that has been translated and quoted by medical historians ever since, "This wretched kind of drugger doth nothing help the diseased." He went further, calling the practice not only without profit, but full of many inconveniences, as to trouble the diseased with torments of conscience, by burdening him with this execrable drugger. Pare lost. His objection was noted, acknowledged, debated, and then largely ignored. The demand for mumia continued for more than a century after his published refutation. When the system of medicine that produced the need for mumia changed, the practice would end. Until that system changed, no amount of moral objection would end it. The Spanish physician Francisco Hernández, writing in the late 16th century, also questioned mumia's utility. The English physician Thomas Willis in the 17th century was skeptical. But skepticism of a single ingredient within a working medical system is not the same as skepticism of the system itself. Mumia continued. Chapter 8: The Long Death of Corpse Medicine, How It Finally Ended. The decline of corpse medicine was not a sudden revulsion. It was a slow, century-long unwinding driven by the collapse of the theoretical framework that had justified it. Humoral medicine, alchemical vitalism, and the doctrine of signatures, the idea that substances resemble what they cure, all began crumbling under the weight of empirical medicine in the late 17th and 18th centuries. As physicians began demanding reproducible evidence, as anatomy and chemistry replaced alchemy, as the idea that you could transfer vital essence from a corpse to a patient became philosophically untenable, the demand for mumia simply declined. It was not banned. It was not scandalized out of existence. It was rendered theoretically unnecessary. By 1700, mumia was becoming a relic in the most progressive European medical schools, particularly in the Netherlands and England. By 1750, it had been dropped from most official pharmacopoeias. By 1800, it survived mainly in folk medicine and in the practices of rural physicians trained in older traditions. The last recorded appearance of mumia in a significant European pharmacopoeia is often cited as the German Merck pharmaceutical catalogue, which listed a mumia vera Egyptiaca, genuine Egyptian mummy, as a product available for purchase as late as 1908. 1908. That is not a typo. A German pharmaceutical company was selling what it described as genuine Egyptian mummy powder, as a medicinal commodity, in the same decade as the Wright brothers' first flight. The history of corpse medicine does not end in the Renaissance. It ends, barely, within living memory of people alive today. Chapter 9: The Mummy Unwrapping Parties, the Entertainment of the Dead. The story of European appetite for Egyptian mummies does not end with medicine. In the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, mummies became objects of another kind of consumption, entertainment. The mummy unwrapping party was a documented social event in Georgian and Victorian England, most notoriously hosted by the physician and antiquarian Thomas Pettigrew. Pettigrew, nicknamed Mummy Pettigrew, performed public unwrappings beginning in 1821, drawing audiences that included royalty, clergy, scientists, and the fashionable public. Tickets were sold. Mummies were examined, discussed, and displayed. The atmosphere was somewhere between lecture theatre, and macabre dinner party. The Duke of Hamilton, so captivated by Egyptian funerary culture after attending Pettigrew's unwrappings, commissioned Pettigrew to mummify his own body after death. Pettigrew obliged. The Duke of Hamilton was interred in 1852 in an Egyptian sarcophagus, in an Egyptian mausoleum, mummified by a Victorian antiquarian in the manner of ancient Egypt. This happened. Beyond the theatre of it, there was still commerce. Mummies arriving in England and Europe in the 19th century were routinely stripped of usable material. The linen wrappings were sold to paper mills. Egyptian mummy linen was reportedly used to manufacture paper in parts of America and Europe in the early to mid-1800s. The story goes, and this sits in the territory of well-circulated historical claim rather than fully verified fact, that a paper manufacturer in Syracuse, New York in the 1850s used mummy linen to produce brown wrapping paper, and that an outbreak of cholera followed. The claim has been repeated in numerous histories but is difficult to confirm directly. It may be legend. It may not. Chapter 10, The Echoes, What Corpse Medicine Tells Us. The historian Louise Noble, in her 2011 study Medicinal Cannibalism in Early Modern English Literature and Culture, makes an argument that has troubled many readers, that corpse medicine was not an aberration in Western medical culture. It was a logical product of it. The same culture that produced Paracelsus, Bacon, and Boyle also produced the systematic consumption of the dead. The people who prescribed and consumed mumia were not ignorant. They were not monsters. They were working within a coherent, internally consistent theoretical framework that simply happened to be wrong in ways they could not yet see. This is the part of the story that modern audiences find hardest to sit with. Because the obvious question, and the question the history of medicine forces on every generation, is not how could they have been so wrong? The question is, what are we doing right now, within our coherent and internally consistent frameworks, that a future generation will find equally incomprehensible? Mumia is also a story about the economics of belief. Once a sufficient market existed, once enough physicians had staked their reputations on it, once enough pharmacists had built their catalogues around it, the system perpetuated itself with extraordinary resilience. Fraud entered the supply chain not because anyone designed it to, but because demand created the incentive and belief suppressed the scrutiny. And there is one more layer. The bodies that were ground into medicine, that were counterfeited, that were unwrapped for entertainment, that were sold by the pound, they belonged to someone. Ancient Egyptians who lived and died and were buried with ritual care across thousands of years of civilization. The mummy trade was also, from their perspective, desecration on an industrial scale. Modern Egyptian authorities have spent decades attempting to recover remains and artifacts exported through the 19th and early 20th centuries. The legal and ethical debates about the repatriation of mummies currently held in European and American museums continue today, are directly descended from the commercial logic that once priced a human being by the pound. Coda, the smell of brown powder. There is a moment that historian Richard Sugg describes in his research that stays with you. He is reviewing an early modern pharmacy inventory, a dry list of stock and prices, and he comes to the entry for mumia, priced per ounce, between pepper and powdered pearls. There is no drama in the entry. No asterisk. No notation of what it is. It is simply there, between the other things a physician might need. As ordinary as salt. A 1,000-year-old human body, ground fine, in a jar on a shelf, between the pepper and the pearls. And someone, every week, for decades, reached for the jar, measured a careful pinch, and helped a patient swallow it. Confident. Credentialed. Correct, by every measure available to them. The history of mumia is not a story about stupidity or savagery. It is a story about how far a coherent system can carry a wrong idea, and how long the dead can be made to serve the living, in ways neither would have chosen. What do you think? Is there a modern medical practice we currently trust that future generations will find just as disturbing? Tell us in the comments. And if this kind of deep, strange, true history is what you're here for, subscribe. We go all the way in, every time.